Hello and welcome to today's episode of Daily Debrief, brought to you by People's Dispatch. I'm Swastika, and let's get into our first story. We're on day 5 of the war in Ukraine, and the weekend has seen a lot of developments both on the military front and the diplomatic front. Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered his defense chiefs to put the country's nuclear deterrence forces on high alert on Sunday and accused the West of taking unfriendly steps against Russia. Now, this comes in reference to the economic sanctions that are being imposed on Russia, led by the Western powers. Meanwhile, the European nations and Canada said on Sunday they would close their airspace to Russian aircraft. In an unprecedented move, the European Union also said it plans to finance the purchase and delivery of weapons to Ukraine. But most significantly, an unprecedented package of sanctions has been rolled out, with certain Russian banks set to be cut off from the SWIFT payment mechanism, and Russia's central bank may lose access to its foreign currency reserve in the West. Fighting and missile attacks continue in multiple cities, with explosions heard in Kiev on Monday and clashes between Russian and Ukrainian forces in the city of Kharkiv. Russian troops continue to make advances in the south. Meanwhile, talks between Russian and Ukrainian delegations are set to take place today, and we may hear of something on this by the time this episode is released. Now, in today's episode, we'll be trying to understand some of the developments, and for this we are joined by NewsClick's Prabir Purkayastha. Now, Prabir, right on top is the biggest news development, which is President Vladimir Putin ordering Russia's strategic nuclear forces on high alert. What does this mean?
Well, in American terminology, they have 5 stages of nuclear alerts: DEF 1, DEFCON 1, DEFCON 2. Okay. Presumably, we are in that kind of situation. So it's not close to hair trigger alert, but it means your nuclear forces then are ready or getting ready in case there are orders that their launch periods should not take too much time. All of this is certainly not looking good, because all said and done, we have nuclear powers on both sides. The United States is very much a player, and therefore any nuclear exchange, any nuclear weapons being fired will lead to the extinction of human civilization as we know it. And this has always been the issue, and the underlying reason why this eastward march of NATO that has happened over the last 30 years has been so much cause for concern, because it brings 2 nuclear powers head to head at the border of Russia. And that's why Russians have been reacting, and that's why a lot of the even well-known commentators in the West have said this is a mistake, that this is not something that the United States and its allies should be doing. This NATO coming to Russian borders is not a very welcome step. It only makes things much worse for the future. And it was all right as long as Russia was weak, but when Russia has regrouped itself, and you have to give the man his due, Putin has been responsible for that, then this brings out what the underlying danger of this policy really was. And I think that's what this particular step that Putin has taken, he says it's response to the aggressive noises coming from the West, means. This is a card that he's playing again, that what is the pressure I have that I can put on the West. Again, wars do not happen by design, and as we have discussed a number of times, a small step can lead to unforeseen consequences, and having nuclear forces in alert makes that relatively easier to happen, and that's why I think it's a very dangerous moment for the world.
Prabir, if we go into the economic aspect of it, now the Western powers have imposed quite severe sanctions on Russia and its economy. Now, how do we look at these sanctions? Many more have come. Does it mean there'll be actual breakdown of trade between Russia and the European Union? Also, how will the EU pay for its gas?
Well, let's look at the nature of the sanctions. One of the sanctions is, of course, a set of sanctions on banks. Not all banks, certain Russian banks that has been identified. They have been taken out of the SWIFT payment system, as you said earlier, that essentially any payment that comes from Russian banks or to Russian banks normally would use the SWIFT payment system.
Yes.
Now, that is not that is basically a facilitating mechanism by which banks exchange information, and that leads to transfer of money from one side to the other. So these banks being taken out means that their ability to conduct transactions with other banks in the world will not be there, and that's obviously a huge blow to all those companies in Russia who use these banks for their transactions to rest of the world. So that is one part of it. A bunch of companies will find it difficult, and of course these banks will lose their ability to transact business in the West. So that's one part of the sanctions. Does it mean that all transactions will cease? No, because it seems that certain other banks are not being sanctioned, and that leads to the other question that you had: what happens to how will Europe pay for its gas? It's possible that they are not being sanctioned so that Europe can pay for its gas. If that is so, then it is easy for those banks in Russia which are out of the SWIFT system then to channel their transactions through the other banks. Then secondary sanctions may start. That if you do that, then you also get sanctioned. So these are what the US did in the case of Iran, that countries like India, for instance, or the State Bank of India, which was dealing with Iran oil, then were threatened with secondary sanctions because they were directly not sanctioned. There's no bar on us because after all we are India. So India could buy and sell Iran oil. It didn't come under sanctions. But state banks' business with the United States then would be affected because of secondary sanctions. So that's the threat that is carried out there. The last point that you raised, for example, that the central bank's access to its foreign exchange reserves. Now this is a very, very sensitive issue. This has never happened with a country of the size of Russia, and the amount of foreign exchange it holds, say for example in European currency, euro. No? So they hold probably something like 250 to 300 billion as currency in Europe, as euro. So it's in that sense it is something. If they are told that they lose access to this, does it mean that it is an expropriation, or is it when you say you will freeze the reserves? That's what it really is being talked about. Yes. That Russian money in, for instance, in euros will be frozen. It has been said they will not be able to use it to shore up for instance, the ruble. Now that effectively means they won't have access to the money which belongs to them. Now this is expropriation and it can be treated as such. Now how does Russia respond to it? If European countries do it, if the European Union do it, what does it say? That, hey, 300 billion of our money. So all the, for instance, money that is there in Russia, in, for example, various companies as shares, share capital, assets, can Russia then expropriate all of them? So this is again uncharted territory. It has happened with Iran. This is not something which is completely new. It has happened with Iran, and of course it happened recently with Afghanistan, as you know. And as you also know, that United States actually took away Afghan money, which was the Afghan Reserve Bank's money, which was held in the US, exactly like this, because it was dollars, therefore it was held by the Fed. And that was taken away, and 3.5 was going to be given to humanitarian organization, 3.5 billion was to be given to, or 4.5 billion was to be given to those who are the victims of 9/11. So these are all the issues that what we were talking about, freezing of the central bank accounts, really mean. A lot of it, as of now, we do not know the details of what's likely to happen, but these are the broad contours of what we see. We will really have to see the fine letter of how this will be implemented, because obviously both Russia and the European Union and the United States have thought about these things. Now, who has thought more? What are the levers each side has? We will have to see. At the moment, Europeans seem to have got a carve out that they can pay for their gas. But if Russia is going to be penalized, what does it mean? That the money it gets will also be stored in euros? So effectively they will still be getting the money, but they really not have access to the money. These are all open questions at the moment, because paying doesn't mean paying. It's a bank transaction, and the money is held in some account in a certain currency. So those are the kind of details that are still not visible. So the next 2, 3, 4 days, we'll probably start to see how this sanction regime that's being imposed on Russia is going to take shape. A lot of questions, but yes, the idea is we hold the financial power. Militarily, you hold the power in Ukraine. That's something that NATO cannot counter in Ukraine, what Russia is doing. But we can inflict this kind of pain on you. What, how and what is something we still have to see. At the moment, only the broad trajectory has been laid out.
In fact, if we could, even about the peace talks, Prabir, how would you see them progressing if it's expected by the end of this bulletin? How do you view that?
I don't think the peace talks, unless something really different is being discussed in the back rooms, which you have no access to, I do not see immediate peace talks leading to results. It's good the talks have started, that the two sides are at least talking to each other. The basic issue that Russia has laid down, that is rights of the Russian-speaking ethnic and linguistic groups. Then what he said was not joining NATO, the relationships with NATO to be reduced or abandoned, NATO troops not entering Ukraine, missiles not entering Ukraine. Now, at the moment, that doesn't seem to be on the cards, because if the war is going on, in fact, as we can see, Ukraine is going closer to European Union, to United States and to NATO. So it doesn't seem that the wind is blowing that way. So I honestly would be surprised that if there is something which will lead to the immediate stoppage of war, even if this is in Ukraine's interest, that both sides disengage, work out on the lines of what the Minsk Accords was, how to give autonomy or self-governing possibilities in Lugansk and Donetsk region. So these would have been the possibilities if the war hadn't taken place. With the kind of situation now that is developed militarily, I'm not very sure that there is space for much resolution through talks at the moment. I think something more decisive has to take place before the talks can really bear fruit.
And finally, a look at the humanitarian angle. Hundreds of thousands of people have been turning up at Ukraine's border crossings with Poland, Romania and Moldova. Many of these countries, which have in fact taken a hardline stance towards refugees arriving from countries such as Syria and Afghanistan. The question is the situation different this time? And how do we see the refugee situation? To understand this, Prabir, I'll come back to you. Now, there was a news report in CBS where the reporter mentioned about how, unlike Iraq and Afghanistan, this is a relatively civilized European city. And there was this phrase that was used. Also, we have read reports on how there has been differential treatment to the African and Indian students who are trying to cross the Polish border. Now, how do we understand the response of the international media when it comes to understanding wars and the refugee crisis?
It's a classic case, really, of talking about civilized cities. Of course, the CBS reporter was careful. He said relatively civilized. He didn't give it the full he didn't give it the full rank of being full civilized. It was relatively civilized. But he compared to the relatively, shall we say, therefore, by contrast, where wars have been going on for a long time, and therefore relatively uncivilized parts of the world, like Iraq and Afghanistan. Of course, it misses the question, who have been waging these wars? But after all, it's the United States and its allies, including Poland, which has been waging this war in Iraq. That was the coalition of the willing. It was the 20-year war that NATO waged in Afghanistan. So these are as if wars that were happening without somebody waging war over there. So it also makes that concept of, you expect wars to take place in Iraq and Afghanistan, but you don't really expect wars in Europe. That was the thing. And that's been said by a number of other leaders as well, or media reports as well. War has come to Europe after decades. forgetting that actually Yugoslavia faced war and it faced NATO bombing. Serbia faced NATO bombing. Belgrade faced NATO bombing. So all of this is sort of airbrushed, shall we say, when you talk of wars and how people, or international, as they call it, international media looks at war. And this comes out in the CBS reporter's description. Of course, he's been widely criticized and he has apologized for his insensitivity. But let's say it, he says twice over here, let me qualify it carefully. So these are his careful words. I wonder what his not so careful words would have been. It's also unfortunate, and that any war is a tragedy, let's face it. Ukrainian citizens leaving their hearth and home, streaming into other countries, not a pleasant sight. It is really ugly. It is something which says what wars are and how wars really destroy people's lives. So all of that is visible now in Ukraine, as it was visible earlier to those who wanted to look in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, where United States soldiers are still in occupation of parts of Syria. So all of that we have to take that, yes, this is war in Europe, unlike wars in Africa or West Asia, which you are more used to seeing. So that's one part of it. But unfortunately, what has also come out in the way Poland handles refugees. We have earlier talked about how refugees coming from Iraq, which were coming from Belarus into Poland, was handled by Poland. In this case also, whether it is the Ukrainian police or the Ukrainian law enforcement authorities, the way they seem to have dealt with African students, and lots of videos are coming in social media, tagged with the CBS report actually, and how they're finding it difficult to even get into trains, how they get into buses. Indian citizens, Indian students, both African and Indian students seem to be in medical colleges over there, going to the Polish border, sometimes on their own, hiring vehicles to go. And how over there is very sharp differential treatment, how they are seen and how others are being seen. If they're Ukrainian people, nationals, how they are seen by both the Ukrainian border guards and also the Polish border guards. And today, if you see the reports, for instance, in Indian papers also, the same comment seems to be there about the Indian students who were not allowed into Poland, which is exactly what the African students have also been complaining. So obviously, when you talk about civilized cities and civilized world, the color of the skin and civilization seems to be correlated, in spite of the fact that Iraq is actually one of the most ancient sites of human civilization, while Ukraine or Europe is a later entry into all of this.
Thank you, Prabir, for those details. We will keep following this story. Do come back to Daily Debrief tomorrow and keep following People's Dispatch. Thank you.